Let's break down every single quarterback and every single tight end moving into week 2 of 2024 fantasy football. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place that you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. All of their week 2 Underdog pick'ems will go live throughout this week leading up to Thursday night football. And if you want a free Josh Allen over half of a yard pick'em, you can claim that right now by using promo code The Catch. That link is down below. And on top of that free Josh Allen over half a yard pick'em, and also don't worry, if you see this video after Thursday, you will still get a free pick'em for Sunday's action if you missed out on the Josh Allen free pick'em. But like I said, on top of that, you're also going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash you can use on Underdog towards any pick'em combo. You take that Josh Allen free pick'em, pair him with one of the other quarterbacks or tight ends going into Sunday, maybe in this video that you guys like, and you will automatically double your entry. Let's hop into our quarterbacks and tight ends and talk about who we are starting or sitting. All right, starting with Thursday night's matchup, let's talk about Josh Allen and company traveling to face the Miami Dolphins. Josh Allen, 31 fantasy points in week 1, a monster towards the goal line, 2 touchdowns on the ground, 39 yards on the ground, good through the air, 2 touchdowns, 232 passing yards, had a fumble. Who cares? Josh Allen's allowed to turn the football over. It's Josh Allen. He's still going to get you 20-plus fantasy points on a weekly basis, the highest drafted quarterback in fantasy football. He is coming out of this matchup with a hand injury, is currently listed as questionable. He says he's not worried about it, something to monitor as the week goes on. But yeah, I mean, are you really going to sit Josh Allen if he's listed as healthy? The answer is no. Start Josh Allen. Josh Allen, good at football. Okay, looking at the tight end position, Dalton Kincaid, the panic level for a lot of you guys is high. I get it. You know, he came out of this week 1 matchup with just 2 targets, 1 reception. Really frustrating because, they're playing the Cardinals and there's a lot of points scored. And then Dawson Knox also had 2 targets, 1 reception. I'm not going to panic on Kincaid too much here. I say go ahead and start him. You probably can't afford to not start him anyways, so let's just see if he bounces back in week 2. Once again, don't overreact too much to week 1. I think Kincaid will be fine throughout this season. I'm not worried about him. Dawson Knox is going to be a sit for me until further notice. I mean, if you're really worried about the tight end situation for the Bills, then that's okay, but let's kind of see a larger sample size before we come into any, decisive conclusions. On the other hand, yes, for the Miami Dolphins, I'm going to continue to start Tua Tagovailoa, one of my favorite starters going into week 1. Admittedly, I did expect a higher ceiling against the Jaguars, but he came out of week 1 as the QB9, 18.6 fantasy points, 338 passing yards, passing touchdown. It's kind of the knock on Tua, like the passing yards are there, but the passing touchdowns aren't always there. But Tua, still a solid option week in and week out. They're at home again in week 2. Should be a good offensive matchup, against the Bills here. They looked very allowing even to the, Cardinals in week 1. So I like Tua a lot this week. Jonnu Smith, very quiet in the season opener. 2 targets, 1 reception. He was a sit last week. He's a sit again moving into week 2. All right, moving along, we got the Niners and the Vikings looking at Sunday's matchups. And at the time of recording this, I have to record these Monday mornings, so I have not seen Monday night's action. So if Brock Purdy breaks his hand, or George Kittle's out for the season, or one of these players is really, really, really worrisome and disappointing. As long as it's not an injury, I'm not going to be too worried because they are facing the Jets. But at the end of the day, I think we're just going to start Purdy and Kittle week in and week out as long as they're healthy. So, might see a lower ceiling in week 1 against the Jets. We'll find out. By the time you're watching this, we'll already know. If something major happens, I'll pin it in the comments down below. But for the most part, we're starting Purdy and we're starting Kittle. Looking at the Vikings, told a lot of you guys, I thought Sam Darnold was going to play okay in week 1, and he played okay in week 1. 24 passing attempts, 19 completions, 208 passing yards, 2 tutties, a pick, added 3 yards on the ground, was only sacked once. The Vikings looked much, much, much better than the Giants, but this is tougher here in week 2. Against the Niners, a much better defense. And I know most of you guys are like, I'm not going to start Sam Darnold anyways. But, there was plenty of Sam Darnold hype after that week 1 performance. But I'm also looking at, people in deep formats, super flex formats, dynasty formats, double quarterback formats. Darnold, worth rostering for sure, but in week 2, we're not going to start him. But shout out to Darnold for a nice week 1 performance. Then we had Josh Oliver and Johnny Munt as the 2 tight ends who got targets. Munt with 3, Oliver with 2. We're not starting any Vikings tight ends. Let's move along. All right, let's take a look at the Seahawks going to face the Patriots in week 2. Geno Smith did have 18 fantasy points in week 1 against the Broncos, but there were times in this game where Smith looked bad. There's like the safeties in this game. There's an interception. He did run for a touchdown. He did throw a touchdown. I don't know. I just don't feel like you guys need to start Geno Smith. Like maybe in a deep format, Superflex, double quarterback, you can still start him. But on the road here, I actually expect the New England Patriots defense to play pretty well. They played pretty well against Joe Burrow and company in week 1. So I'm not going to go out of my way to start Geno Smith. If you're forced to, only in a double quarterback league would I consider him, but I wouldn't expect a high ceiling. Noah Fant, once again, preseason hype around Noah Fant, and I don't know why, but he walked out of this game with just 3.1 fantasy points, and there's no other tight end on this team that we need to talk about. So Noah Fant's going to be a sit, and then Geno Smith is also going to be a sit for me. Moving over to the brisket himself, Jacoby Brissett. I will say I expected him to play much worse in week 1. He did not turn the football over, but still no ceiling here. 8 fantasy points. No touchdowns on the ground or through the air. Nothing for Jacoby Brissett. We're not starting him. The Seahawks defense did look good in week 1, so I have no faith in Jacoby Brissett from a fantasy standpoint, even in deeper or double quarterback formats. In terms of the Patriots tight ends, I mean, we saw 3 targets to Henry, 3.8 fantasy points, 4 targets to Austin Hooper, 5.1 fantasy points, but yeah, I'm not putting any New England Patriots tight ends in my starting lineups as we approach week 2. All right, next up we've got Danny Dimes and company traveling to face Jaden Daniels and company, Giants and Commanders here. So Danny Dimes, I don't know if we should legally be allowed to still call Daniel Jones Danny Dimes, but he's still remaining the starting quarterback in week 2, according to head coach Brian DeBall. I mean, what else would we have? I guess Drew Lock or my boy Tommy DeVito, but yeah, I mean, we're not starting Daniel Jones in week 2. We weren't starting him in week 1. He threw 2 picks. He had 6.9 fantasy points. Listen, I knocked Danny Dimes in. I just called him Danny Dimes again. But, I knocked Daniel Jones in more than one video last week, including the must-start defenses as well as the start-set quarterback. So I'm not going to harp on him here, but it's just like we're not starting Daniel Jones, even if he is really, truly dating Kay Adams, which if he is, shout out to you, Daniel Jones, but we're not starting you in fantasy. Theo Johnson, 2.8 fantasy points, 4 targets. Daniel Bellinger, 1.3 fantasy points, 1 target. We're not starting any Giants tight ends. Jaden Daniels did not throw a touchdown in his rookie debut, but it did not matter. He rushed for 2 touchdowns. The thesis was true on Jaden Daniels. I want to see him improve in the passing game. I mean, he wasn't like awful, 17 completions off 24 attempts, but tougher defense in week 1. I think we'll see a better Jaden Daniels in week 2, at least through the air. And the rushing upside we know for sure is there. I mean, like I said, 2 rushing touchdowns, 28 fantasy points for Jaden Daniels. I expect another solid performance in week 2 against the Giants. Jaden Daniels, I think, a must-start quarterback this week. Now, on the other hand, look at the tight ends here. Zach Ertz, 4 targets, 5.8 fantasy points. Keep an eye on him. He was on the field for 71% of snaps compared to Ben Sinnott. 0 targets, 0 receptions, 22% of snaps for for Ben Sinnott. And then we actually saw John Bates, who, only walked out with 1 target, 0 receptions, but he was on the field for 47% of snaps. I'm saying for those of you guys kind of high on Ben Sinnott in redraft formats, maybe we need to kind of pump the brakes a bit here. Looks like Zach Ertz is, if anything, the tight end to own for the Washington Commanders moving into week 2. All right, next up on the slate, we're going to have the Chargers traveling to face the Carolina Panthers. Justin Herbert in week 1. I really encourage you guys to sit. If you go back and watch last week's video, I had Herbert as a sit, which some people did not like, but I just wanted to see this offense, new offense, Jim Harbaugh, expected it to be run heavy, new pass catching room. I just wanted to see things kind of come to fruition here. And thesis was correct for fantasy, at least. Justin Herbert just 10.3 fantasy points, 1 touchdown went to Ladd McConkey, 26 attempts, 17 completions, 144 passing yards. Gritty, gross game against the Raiders. He gets moved up to the category this week because they're facing the Carolina Panthers, who are absolute butt. So, Herbert, I don't really want to start him. I don't really know what this fantasy season is going to bring for Herbert. If you punted the position, I hope you went 2 quarterbacks and got another guy late who maybe feel a little bit better about. I don't know. I hope it gets better. I hope they get more involvement with guys like Josh Palmer and maybe Quentin Johnston. Ladd McConkey came out of week 1 fine, scored the only touchdown through the air for the Chargers. So I don't know. It's gonna be a run first team. The defense looked better than I thought. I just don't know what this fantasy season holds for Justin Herbert. He gets moved up to the category against the Panthers, but then they get the Steelers in week 3, the Chiefs in week 4. He's going to be probably a sit unless he just comes out of this matchup with 3 or 4 passing touchdowns. So I'm very hesitant with Herbert right now, but we'll see what happens. On the other hand, Hayden Hurst had 3 targets, 5 fantasy points. Will Dissly had 1 target, 2 fantasy points. Can't start these guys in any formats at the time, at least. Moving along, Bryce Young is still really bad. All that speak about Dave Canales fixing this offense and what he did with Baker Mayfield last year and the year before, what he did with Geno Smith. I just don't know if it's going to matter. I just think maybe Bryce Young is bad at football, or maybe the Panthers just really suck offensively. And I don't know. It was a bad matchup against the Saints on the road. We all thought it would be bad. I still hope as the season goes on, you look at the Panthers, they get the Raiders in week 3, the Bengals in week 4. I think we're still going to see some decent offensive performances, but they basically looked worse than they looked last year. So I don't know. We're not even considering starting Bryce Young, who had 2 interceptions, 11 fantasy points. Jatavion Sanders, the tight ends were not involved in this game at all. Jatavion Sanders had 1 target, 1 reception. There was no other targets to tight ends on this team at all. So we're not starting any Panthers tight ends. And, frankly, we're not starting any Panthers offensive players until further notice. All right, let's move along to the Saints facing off against the Cowboys. Derek Carr, a good performance in week 1 with 21 fantasy points, 3 touchdowns through the air against the team that we just talked about, the Carolina Panthers. I don't quite know if Derek Carr is going to be able to do that against the Cowboys in week 2, so I have him in the category, and that's mainly for you guys in Superflex double quarterback leagues, deeper leagues. If you're desperate, Jordan Love's your only quarterback in a 16-man league or something. I think he's okay, but I don't want to read too much into this performance against the Panthers and then look at a team like the Cowboys, who are now are now at home in week 2 and made Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson is bad at football, but made Deshaun Watson look really bad at football in week 1. So I think Carr, fringe, desperate start, but I don't want to get too carried away. Taysom Hill hits the category. I thought he was going to be much more involved in this game because he was involved early on. So the only reason Hill gets the mark, because I think some of you guys might argue he should get the sit mark, is because in some leagues you can still play Taysom Hill at the tight end position, and the volatility that's here, the risk, but here and there, maybe when we've got guys like David Njoku and Jake Ferguson, who we'll talk about in a second, if you're desperate enough, you could throw Taysom Hill out there. But at the same time, he only walked away with 4.6 PPR points in week 1, and we expected that to be a little bit of a higher mark, especially, they were getting him involved early and often, at least in the run game, but it is what it is. So he gets the mark. If you want to argue he should be a sit, that's fine too. Now let's look at Juwan Johnson, who had a touchdown in this matchup, but just 3 targets, 10 fantasy points. He's still a sit for me. I'm okay with, picking up Juwan Johnson off the waiver wire, seeing what happens here, but the target share was still low, which brings us to Foster Moreau, who also had a low target share, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 43 receiving yards and a touchdown, then 14.3 fantasy points. So yeah, maybe there's something here, but this was against the Panthers. I don't know how I feel about Johnson or Moreau. If you're chasing them on the waivers, that's fine, but it's worth noting Foster Moreau's also in concussion protocol, is going to be questionable throughout the week. So, if Foster Moreau doesn't play in week 2, maybe I like Juwan Johnson more. Ultimately, I think Hill, Johnson, Foster Moreau, might be a product of that week 1 matchup, and maybe are going to be guys that are just too frustrating to even consider starts throughout the season. So mainly going to stay away from them. All right, Dak Prescott, not a great performance in week 1, at least fantasy-wise, but it just didn't need to be a very good performance when the Dallas Cowboys defense was balling. And I mean, it was just one of those games where the game script got away from Dak Prescott. So I like him a little bit more in week 2 because I think it'll be a little bit more competitive, hopefully. But this is a good Saints defense, but still, you're starting Dak Prescott essentially no matter what. It's a little bit of a tough stretch here. They had Cleveland week 1, then they get the Saints and the Ravens, a good matchup in week 4 against the Giants, but then they get the Steelers and then Detroit in week 6, which should at least be competitive, but Lions defense not bad necessarily. So it's going to be an interesting couple weeks, but I just think you have to start Dak Prescott on a week in, week out basis. And one of the biggest bummers of week 1's matchup between the Cowboys is we saw 2 injuries to major tight ends, including Jake Ferguson, who has not been ruled out for week 2. So if Jake Ferguson starts, I don't know. I probably have him as a sit. The Saints played really well against the tight end position in week 1, albeit it was the Panthers and a rookie tight end, Jatavion Sanders. So I think coming off the injury, if Ferguson starts, I'll probably have him as a sit. I'm just kind of nervous about that situation. And then if Luke Schoonmaker ends up being the starter, I'm going to go ahead and say sit him as well. So we don't know at the time of recording this what's going to happen. I assumed going into preparation for this video that Ferguson was just going to be ruled out, but now reports are saying that he's questionable for week 2, even with the MCL sprain. So I think regardless, I'm staying away from the Cowboys tight ends moving into week 2. All right, next up, we've got the much anticipated matchup between Anthony Richardson and Malik Willis. So unfortunately, one of the biggest overall, maybe the biggest overall disappointment in week 1 fantasy football was Jordan Love getting injured. Going to have a major impact across all the Packers offensive players, but most importantly, the Packers quarterback situation. But let's start with the Colts. Anthony Richardson, 56 yards on the ground, 9.3 yards per carry, and a touchdown. So the thesis, Anthony Richardson can run the football, is definitely still true. But what was even better in this game is Anthony Richardson was slinging the football. Wasn't the most accurate in this game, 19 attempts, 9 completions. But man, some of those throws out of Anthony Richardson are like you don't even care. I mean, that first touchdown throw to Alec Pierce is probably the best throw I saw all of week 1. So 27 fantasy points. Yeah, starting Anthony Richardson week in and week out as long as he's healthy. No reason whatsoever to bench Anthony Richardson. On the other hand here, we got Kylan Granson with 1 target, no fantasy points at the tight end position. And then we got Mo Alley Cox with 1 target, no fantasy points. We're not even remotely considering those guys in any format. Now, moving along to the Green Bay Packers. Looks like Malik Willis is headed for a week 2 start with our boy Jordan Love out. And, we're going to sit Malik Willis, especially because you look at Malik Willis with the potential to be able to run the football, which he has in some of his previous starts dating back to 2022, primarily a week 9 matchup against Kansas City where he had 8 carries for 40 yards. In that same year, he had 5 rushes for 12 yards against Houston, not nearly as good. But then second time he played Houston, 7 rushes for 43 yards and a rushing touchdown. It was also 2 years ago on a different team, but the main thing here is if you're even looking at Malik Willis, for some reason, at least maybe to argue, I don't know, that he can still run the football. The Colts defense, as prepared as anyone to go up against a quarterback who can run the football when Anthony Richardson's their starting quarterback. So Malik Willis, I don't think anyone out there in any format was considering starting him, but he's definitely a sit. I do want to talk about Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft because Luke Musgrave was one of my favorite late-round tight ends in the offseason, and he gave you a goose egg in week 1 with just 2 targets, 0 catches. But more concerning, I would argue, is that he was only on the field for 25% of snaps. So Luke Musgrave's a sit until further notice, especially with the quarterback situation there for the Packers. And then Tucker Kraft came onto the field for 96% of snaps, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 37 receiving yards, 5.7 fantasy points. So he may very well be the Packers tight end to actually own. But for me, I'm staying away from all Packers tight ends until further notice. But Kraft, if he's out there on the waiver wire in a bad position, he might be the guy to own, but I feel a lot better if Jordan Love was the starting quarterback. So let's stay away from the Packers and all around, basically, at tight end and quarterback here, and then stay away from the tight ends for the Colts. But A-Rich, definitely a must start as we approach week 2. Moving along, we will have the Browns traveling to face the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I feel kind of gross about this game. We're definitely sitting Deshaun Watson, player I did not like going into week 1, threw 2 picks, had a fumble, threw a touchdown, 169 yards through the air, 39 yards on the ground, 12.6 fantasy points. We all watched it. It was a gross offensive performance. No reason to start Deshaun Watson. Even in super flex formats, I'd be really worried if you went with Watson as your QB2. David Njoku got hurt in this game. He did look good before he got hurt. 5 targets, 4 receptions, 44 receiving yards, 8.4 fantasy points, but he's now week to week with an ankle injury. I hope they don't rush him out there too soon. I don't want to see him re-aggravate this injury. We're going to sit him even if he ends up playing in week 2. Like I said, he's week to week is what the report has right now. So I'm going to go ahead and leave David Njoku as a sit even if he plays. I just think it's too risky, which leads us to Jordan Akins, who had 4 targets, 3 receptions, 5 fantasy points. Maybe he emerges as a guy who gets enough volume to be a streaming option in this offense that does like the tight end position, but until we see it, I'm just staying away from this offense outside of guys like Amari Cooper and Jerome Ford until further notice. And then moving along to my long-haired dream quarterback, Trevor Lawrence, who, if you guys have followed the channel, you guys know that year in and year out, I sit here and I defend Trevor Lawrence like he's my daughter, and he's just kind of stinks. I mean, I still believe in Trevor Lawrence, I think, but it's like I just don't know. I mean, last year he played through a lot of injuries towards the end of the year, still gave you some solid performances in fantasy, stealing a 32 fantasy points in week 11, even with some of those injuries lingering. But I think T-Law at this point, we're just going to downgrade to a fringe start, QB2 start guy, super flex start guy. And I'm really worried about Trevor Lawrence's ultimate fantasy ceiling throughout this season. I know it's just week 1. I don't want to overreact, but I had this matchup between the Jaguars and the Dolphins starred and circled. I talked about it throughout the week. I expected more out of you, T-Law, one of our favorite quarterbacks here on the channel, and now you're getting downgraded because you made me look like a doofus with 11 fantasy points in week 1. But hey, I'm not going to ultimately react too much here. I don't think, at least throughout the season, on Trevor Lawrence. And I don't want to do the same to my boy Evan Ingram, who had 4 targets, 1 reception, and 1.5 fantasy points in week 1. I think he'll be okay as the season goes on. Let's go ahead and show some faith. He was still a top 5 tight end in the last 2 years in fantasy football. I expect the Jaguars to get better, the passing game to get better as the season goes on. Still think you probably have to start Evan Ingram in week 2, but depends on who you have on the bench. Let's not overreact too much, though. Ingram probably still going to be a start in your lineup as we approach the week. All right, moving along, we're going to have the Jets traveling to Tennessee to face the Titans. Once again, a reminder, when I record these videos, Monday Night Football has not been played yet, so I don't know if Aaron Rodgers is going to come out and, tear his ACL on the first snap or something, or just look god-awful against the Niners defense, or look really good, or maybe somewhere in between. So if anything major happens, I'll pin it in the comments down below. But I think for now, Rodgers probably just start, a guy you could probably throw out there and, double quarterback super flex leagues. We'll kind of find out a better picture. This one I'm a little bit more worried to make a true call on. So I think for now, I'll leave him as like a fringe QB2, and we'll kind of see what happens. Tyler Conklin, I do like as a guy to kind of roster if you're kind of, in a tough situation at tight end, but I don't really know in the first couple weeks if we're going to see too much. He gets the Niners, then the Titans in week 2, and then the Patriots in week 3. So a couple more stout matchups, but I think Tyler Conklin a good player to watch, but I don't think he's going to really, be too elevated as a player that we have to start in week 2. Like I said, I don't know, maybe Monday Night Football against the Niners, he scores 2 touchdowns or something. But for now, I think we'll just leave him as a sit and see what happens. Then moving along to the Titans, Will Levis. Man, I had some faith in Will Levis in the offseason as a potential upside, like late-round quarterback who could elevate his play with the franchise giving him a lot, working around him in the offseason offensively, and then the defense improved in the offseason. But Will Levis looked bad in week 1. 8.6 fantasy points, 2 really bad interceptions, a lost fumble, 127 yards through the air. We're not starting Will Levis anytime soon. If you drafted him in like a double quarterback super flex league, hoping for a year or two breakout, he's on your bench, I don't think you need to like drop him or anything, but yeah, we're not starting him. And then looking at the tight ends for the Titans, always hard to say tight ends and then tight ends right after each other. But anyways, Chicken Conquo had a touchdown, 9.5 fantasy points. Take that away, he had 1 reception outside of that. And then, I was expecting Josh Weil to be the other tight end we would take a look at for this team, but it ended up being Nick Vannett, who had 2 targets, 2 receptions. And Conco, I think, fine to scoop up off the waiver wire, could be involved in this game, but we're looking at 2 tight ends who had 4 combined targets, so none of these guys going to be a start anytime soon. They're going to be completely touchdown dependent as we approach the rest of the season. All right, moving along, we've got the Buccaneers traveling to face the Lions, and I told you so. Got to toot my horn a little bit here. Baker Money Maker Mayfield. One of my favorite starts in week 1. A guy I told you guys in Saturday's video, if you're out there, even in a single quarterback format, maybe you punted the quarterback position, maybe you got a more injury-prone guy, or if you're in a deeper format, or for some reason, if he's available in a super flex or double quarterback league, go out and pick up Baker Mayfield because he's going to ball out in week 1. One of the best fantasy performances out of a quarterback in week 1 at 29 fantasy points, 4 passing touchdowns, 289 yards through the air, 21 yards on the ground, no turnovers, no picks, no fumbles. Mayfield, I get it, he was facing the Washington Commanders, but that's part of why we liked him. Now he's balled out. He's on the fantasy manager's radars, and I think he gets another nice matchup here against the Lions in week 2. So Mayfield I had as a start last week. He gets the start mark again in week 2. Definitely like him. I don't think the ceiling is as high, but the Lions defense still show that they are very volatile in week 1 against the Rams. So Baker, I like again in week 2. Cade Otton's going to be a sit, very quiet in week 1. He was on the field for 86% of snaps, but just 2 targets, 1 reception. No reason to start Cade Otton as we approach the week. Moving along to the Lions, Jared Goff, I expected more of in this game. Disappointing game for Jared Goff for me, but I think you still start him. Another good competitive game script. The problem with Jared Goff is like the running game's just so heavy for the Lions that when they have these lower scoring games, like you're going to expect 2, maybe 3 touchdowns to probably go to those running backs in Gibbs and Monty. So I still like Goff. I still think he's a solid option. I mean, Goff, a guy last year who gave you 14 points in week 1, then 23, 19, 12, 27, and 22 in the following 5 weeks and finished as the quarterback 7. So you got to expect some volatility out of Goff. You know what you got when you drafted him. Then Laporta, fine in week 1, but not really for where you drafted him. This is why I stay away from drafting tight ends early in drafts, but nonetheless, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 45 receiving yards, 8.5 receiving yards. And at the time of recording this, he's the tight end 8 on the week. We'll see if Kittle or Conklin or someone else changes that in Monday Night Football. But this was a really bad week overall for the tight end position. But Laporta, regardless, you're going to start him week in and week out, no matter what. All right, next up, we've got the noodle arm fellow mustache man himself. I love Gardner Minshew. I'm telling you guys, if I could spend a whole week with Gardner Minshew, I would absolutely do it, but we're not going to start him in fantasy football. Threw a pick, had a lost fumble, 257 yards through the air, tutty, 11 fantasy points. Much tougher matchup. I know the Ravens defense allowed a lot of points in week 1, but that was against the greatest quarterback of the current era that we're in, and Patrick Mahomes, and players like Xavier Worthy and Rashee Rice and Isaiah Pacheco, and there are some good offensive playmakers still on the Raiders team, don't get me wrong, but we're not starting Gardner Minshew. I'm sorry. Even in double quarterback superflex, we're not starting him. Brock Bowers, or I guess I should say, first of all, Michael Mayer, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 2 fantasy points. We're not starting him. But Brock Bowers, I had in the category. You drafted him as your only tight end. Start him. You don't have a better option. Start him. A lot of people drafted Bowers Also drafted like another tight end either behind him or in front of him because he's a rookie, but he was involved enough on the field for 68% of snaps, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 58 receiving yards. Michael Mayer was on the field for 57% of snaps, and then Harrison Bryant was nothing to 7% of snaps. So Bowers, good PPR day, 11.8 fantasy points. Compared to other tight ends on the week before Monday Night Football, Bowers the tight end 3. So I think he continues to be a guy that is definitely maybe not my favorite start, but going to be a good enough start. And as the weeks go on, he might just get upgraded to the start category. For now, it's more of a depends on who else is on your roster, but I think he's perfectly okay moving into week 2. A couple more players who are perfectly okay no matter what on a week in, week out basis are going to be all of the quarterbacks and all of the tight ends for the Baltimore Ravens, and that includes Mark Andrews. But first of all, Lamar Jackson, 25 fantasy points. Could be even better in week 2 against the Raiders. It just doesn't matter. We all know that we're starting Lamar Jackson as long as he's healthy, no matter what, and we're taking what we get, whether it's good or bad, but for the most part, going to be good. Now, Mark Andrews, you might be panicking on 2 targets, 2 receptions, 3.4 fantasy points, still on the field for 74% of snaps. And at the end of the day, the Chiefs just said, we're not going to allow Mark Andrews to be part of this game. Game script didn't end up like helping Mark Andrews because the game script was the Ravens' offensive line was bad. And Chris Jones and company were all over, Lamar Jackson. And Lamar Jackson said, I'm just going to run the football. And if Mark Andrews is not going to be available, I'm going to make Isaiah Likely look incredible in this game, not discrediting Isaiah Likely, and then we're just going to throw the ball to Zay Flowers and get, both our running backs and Derrick Henry and Justice Hill involved in their respective ways, and then ultimately lose this game, and we had 3 opportunities to win it. But regardless, I'm not worried about Mark Andrews. If you own him, you can still start him. Depends on who else is on your roster. I think he's a perfectly fine start. Then Isaiah Likely, when the ball was in his hands, looked incredible. We go back to the end of 2023 when Mark Andrews missed time, weeks 14 through 18. I guess through 17 is all we really need to look at, but he had 11 or more fantasy points in all those games except week 16 against the Niners where he had 8.6. So, likely it could very well be developing into the tight end 1 here for the Ravens, which is what I think a lot of fantasy managers are fearing if they own Mark Andrews. But at the end of the day, till further notice, I still think there's enough to start Andrews, and likely if the pattern continues here and it's not good for Andrews, then we'll pivot. But I think for now, you own Andrews, you're probably still starting him. Depends on who else you have. If you own Andrews and Likely, I don't know. I'd probably just go with the hot hand and start Likely. Definitely an interesting situation to continue to evaluate as the weeks go on. But I think at the end of the day, we have all solid offensive performers at quarterback and tight end as the season goes on for the Ravens. All right, next up, we've got the Rams traveling to face the Cardinals. I do like this matchup overall. I do think that it has an opportunity for a lot of offensive points scored. But I also like the Rams in week 1, and I felt like they kind of disappointed. But once again, they were dealing with so many injuries, offensive line injuries, Puka Nacua. So I'm kind of torn here. I put Stafford in the start category because this Cardinals defense is so bad, and they gave up 4 total touchdowns to Josh Allen, 2 on the ground, 2 through the air, that I still expect the Rams to have a good day. I expected a better day for Stafford in week 1. He had 15 fantasy points, threw a pick, threw a touchdown, 317 passing yards. When you take away the pick, it's really not that bad of a fantasy performance for where he was drafted. So I'm okay with starting Stafford this week. Depends on who else you have, but due to the matchup, he comes in as a start. And then Colby Parkinson I have as a sit. But it's kind of an asterisk there because we saw Parkinson get involved, especially after Puka left this game. He finished with 8.7 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 47 total receiving yards. I do think he could end up being an okay waiver addition, but I think you could put him in the category if Puka does not play in week 2 at the time of recording this. I don't know if he's going to play or be out or what the severity of the injury there is. So I think Parkinson could end up being a streaming option, but I don't know. I don't want to go out of my way to go ahead and throw him out there. Now, Kyler Murray, on the other hand, another kind of disappointing week 1 performance in an offensive matchup that had a lot of points between the Cardinals and the Bills, but he walked away ultimately with just 14 fantasy points, 1 touchdown, 57 yards on the ground, 162 through the air. So weird game, points scored, but it just wasn't good for fantasy. Trey McBride, 30 receiving yards, 5 receptions off of 9 targets, 8 fantasy points. So disappointing day for both of these guys. I think they'll be okay against the Rams at home in week 2. I'm not going to panic on Kyler. Not going to panic on Trey McBride. I think both are solid starts as we approach the week. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at the Bengals traveling to face the Kansas City Chiefs. Joe Burrow, Slim Shady himself. What happened here in week 1? Week 1, Joe Burrow is apparently bad. Okay, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm just looking at last year and this year, but 3 points last year, 8 points this year, at least improved by 5 points. But I started the week all like gun-ho about Joe Burrow against the Patriots, and one or two of you guys started to say, I don't know, like the Patriots defense not that bad last year, and then Higgins came up with the last-minute hamstring injury, and then Chase was like, I'm not playing, and then he did play, and then I don't know. This was just such a tough situation to evaluate as the week went on, and the right call was to sit Joe Burrow. But I'm going to go ahead and say start Joe Burrow in week 2. I think this is going to be a more competitive matchup. I think Burrow will be okay. Maybe Higgins is back. Maybe he's not. Chase should perform better in week 2. If they play bad in week 2, then we're hitting like the panic button to the full degree, but Burrow, I think you got to trust the process here. You know, last week in week 2, he only had 16 fantasy points, but he was hurt. I mean, I don't know what the excuse is right now is the problem. I mean, the Bengals were at home. Joe Burrow's not hurt. I guess the excuse is Higgins didn't play and Jamar Chase hasn't been practicing, but like at some point we got to really look at this situation and say, what is the problem here? But I'm going to keep the faith. I think Burrow will be okay in week 2, and we can go ahead and trust him, but we'll see what happens. Might be a little bit risky. Maybe you put him in the category. But where you drafted Burrow, you're probably going to have to start him. Gesicki, 4.8 fantasy points. Tanner Hudson, 1.8 fantasy points. Nothing there for us. We're sitting them. The Chiefs going to be the easiest team to evaluate week in and week out. I mean, but let's go ahead and talk about it real quick because Mahomes only had 16 fantasy points in week 1. Then Taylor Swift's boyfriend only had 6.4 fantasy points in week 1. Am I going to panic on either of these players? No, I'm just not. You know, I mean, especially once Hollywood Brown is back in this offense, we saw enough flashes in week 1 that this passing attack for Mahomes and company is going to be very, very good throughout the season. So not as tough of a matchup in week 2. They're at home again. This Bengals defense is worse than the Ravens defense. There's plenty of firepower offensively for the Chiefs. Not really a debate here. You're starting Mahomes. You're starting Kelsey. Moving in to week 2. Next up, we got the Steelers traveling to face the Denver Broncos, and I will just start with the quarterbacks for the Steelers here. I expect it to be Justin Fields, but maybe Dangerous is good to go. He was inactive week 1 with that calf injury, and maybe they pivot here to Russell Wilson. I don't know. Either way, I'm not starting either quarterback. I mean, it's not the worst matchup, but this Broncos defense was okay, but also bad. Very Broncos fashion in week 1. Fields showed that rushing upside still, 57 yards on the ground, ran the football 14 times, but did not throw or run for a touchdown against the Falcons. So I'm just not starting Fields. I'm not starting Russell Wilson. I think Pat Freiermuth, where you drafted him, kind of falls into the category. 6.7 fantasy points. Did have 4 targets, caught every football, 4 receptions. I think he's okay if you have to start him, but I don't know how high the ceiling's going to be really for any Steelers football player throughout the fantasy season. So Freiermuth, maybe, but that's about as far as I'm going to go. In terms of the Broncos, Bo Nix, 13 fantasy points in week 1. Showed some stuff. Most of it not good, what we expected. Threw 2 picks. Did run for a touchdown. Showed some life at the end of this game. Had some passes that you were like, that was a good pass. A lot of passes that were like, that was a bad pass. So got about what we expected. I don't think we're going to start him against the Steelers defense that was pretty much terrifying. I mean, I was like scared for Kirk Cousins at points in that week 1 matchup against the Falcons. So don't think we're going to start Bo Nix in any format in week 2. Greg Dulcich, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 3 fantasy points. Honestly, I didn't even check the stats for any other Broncos tight ends. We're not starting any tight end or quarterback for the Broncos going into week 2. All right, moving along to Sunday Night Football, we will have the Bears traveling to face the Houston Texans. And yeah, Caleb Williams had 93 passing yards in week 1, 15 yards on the ground, had a fumble. was sacked twice, did not throw any touchdowns, did not throw any picks, did not run for any touchdowns. Looked pretty bad, to say the least. There are a lot of plays where you're just kind of scratching your head. Defense really ended up winning this game for the Bears. But I'm going to leave Caleb Williams in the category. I'm going to leave it up to you if you drafted Caleb Williams to kind of make a decision here. Do you think he'll improve in week 2 or not? Are you going to keep the faith in Caleb and what we saw in the preseason or not? I wasn't as high on Caleb Williams going into the year. I remember having a debate like the last week of the offseason during an Underdog draft, like talking about rookie quarterbacks and really just reminding you guys that the ceiling is really low for rookie quarterbacks. Even you look at C.J. Stroud in this same matchup. You go back to C.J. Stroud last year, he averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game, was a QB 11, and that was like phenomenal for a rookie quarterback. It's really rare that we see like the type of upside that Anthony Richardson, when healthy, showed last year, or like a Justin Herbert type rookie season in fantasy football. So I encourage you guys kind of pump the brakes, although Caleb Williams was looking really good throughout the preseason. With a player like this, the narrative is going to flip and switch like crazy. A few weeks ago, everyone was like, Caleb Williams, I mean, this guy can play the game. The NFL speed is nothing for him, and that could still be true. Don't get me wrong. I'm not harping too much on Caleb Williams here. But then now in week 1, it's like panic button. Like, they got the win, but does it matter? Caleb Williams sucked in it, so... he's going to be one of these players and be really polarizing, especially in his rookie season. But, yeah, I'll put him in the category. I probably wouldn't start him, but maybe you want to. Now, when we look at the tight end position, we got Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett. Cole Kmet was on the field for 48% of snaps. Gerald Everett ended up with 1 target, 1 reception, -1 receiving yards for 0.9 fantasy points. Then Cole Kmet, 1 target, 1 reception, 4 receiving yards for 1.4 fantasy points. So, if you liked Cole Kmet as a late-round option, if you thought Gerald Everett was going to take over here, if you stayed away from both, whatever it is, you're still not starting either of these tight ends moving into week 2. Then we look at the Texans. They're starting C.J. Stroud on a week-in, week-out basis no matter what. Interesting, he had 18.6 fantasy points in week 1 when that is what he averaged per game last year. Nonetheless, ceiling is maybe not super high with how many offensive playmakers we have, including Joe Mixon being really involved in week 1. But I do think we're going to see some high ceiling performances out of Stroud as the season goes on. But what we do know, the floor is really safe, 16, 17, 18 fantasy points. It's probably what you're going to walk away with at worst on a weekly basis out of Stroud with how many studs are on this offense, especially at the wide receiver position. So Stroud, not much of a debate. You're starting him. You drafted him to start him every single week. Dalton Schultz, I put in the category. I don't really know why. He's probably a sit, honestly. Just 3 targets, 3 receptions in week 1. There's not really any other tight end to worry about on this team. I mean, Brevin Jordan had 2 targets, but I'm not going to really be too nervous here about anybody. Schultz, I just think he's going to be one of those guys who's going to be volatile. He's going to have those weeks where he does score a touchdown or is involved enough that he hits double digits, and it's like, I don't know if the pattern kind of comes where he's at like 5 or less fantasy points for 3, 4, 5 weeks in a row, then he's going to get downgraded to a sit. But for now, where you're drafted Schultz, he's maybe a starter in a desperate situation, but that's just because he's tied to the Houston Texans offense. So for the most part, probably a sit. But if you're desperate, I guess you could roll with Dalton Schultz moving into week 2. All right, last but not least, moving into Monday Night Football, we've got the Falcons. Kirk O'Chain's traveling to face the Eagles and Jalen Hurts. Should be a good game, I hope. But if it's any indication, if week 1's any indication, I should say, of how the Falcons are going to look, then I don't know. This offensive line for the Falcons looked bad, which led to Kirk Cousins really struggling in this matchup. So 8 fantasy points, a touchdown, 2 picks, game-losing pick, 155 yards in the air. I mean, he had like no time to throw the football in this game. The Steelers, like I said earlier, were like terrifying to watch the way that they were getting in Kirk Cousins' face throughout this game. But I had him as a start last week. I expected more, but he gets downgraded to an And this is really only in like double quarterback superflex formats that I would even consider him this week. The Eagles defense did not look good in week 1. I do think that their front 7 can make life difficult once again in week 2 for Kirk Cousins, but secondary struggled in week 1, although poor field conditions, a lot of slipping and sliding in week 1 in that Brazil game. But I think Cousins, superflex double quarterback, I think he'll get better as the season goes on. I'm not going to completely panic here on Cousins, but definitely a disappointing week 1 performance. I expected more out of Kirk Chains in week 1. But at least the silver lining is that Kyle Pitts scored a touchdown. Thank God and all that is mighty and good in the world. We have a Kyle Pitts double-digit fantasy performance in week 1, 11.6 fantasy points, just 3 targets, 3 receptions, but a touchdown. Like, you drafted Kyle Pitts, you probably feel okay. He ended the week before Monday Night Football was played, at least as the tight end 4. So Pitts, yeah, we'll go ahead and we will start him again in week 2. But I will note that the Eagles played well against the tight end position in week 1. But for now, with how bad the tight end position has started the year, we're still rolling with Kyle Pitts. Jalen Hurts, on the other hand, 18 fantasy points, 278 yards through the air, 2 tutties, 2 picks, 33 yards on the ground, 2 fumbles. There's some points in this game, if you were watching this game, where you were like, Jalen Hurts looks kind of bad, but this is fantasy football. In 6-point passing touchdown leagues, he still got you over 20 fantasy points. Like I said, in 4-point passing touchdown leagues, he still got you 18 fantasy points. Before Monday Night Football has been played, he's the QB 10 on the week. Floor safe, ceiling's high. We know what we're getting. We're starting Jalen Hurts no matter what, essentially. Dallas Goedert, I think you can still start him, mainly because, once again, the tight end position started out the year really, really bad. He had 7 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 receptions. Basically, Freiermuth against the Falcons in week 1 still came out with 4 receptions. So, I don't love Dallas Goedert. Maybe he should be downgraded to the category, but I think where you drafted Goddard, you're probably going to have to roll with him. And I think the floor is still 7 or 8 points, which, don't get me wrong, it's not what we want to play for, but that might just be the situation that you're forced into in week 2. So don't really love Goddard, but I think he just kind of by nature has to be a start as we approach week 2. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today or find it helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe button on the way out and come join the community. It would really mean the world to me, and I can get one step closer to moving out of my mom's basement. But more importantly, guys, in the comment section, any questions you guys have, any fantasy football questions, starts, sits, quarterbacks, tight ends, running backs, wide receivers, defenses, kickers, streaming options for the week, trade options for the week, waiver wire options for the week, roster reviews, whatever you guys need, drop it down below. I will get back to every single comment on this video throughout the week, before Thursday night's matchup and then before all of Sunday and Monday's action as well. Happy to help you guys do whatever I can to get a victory in week 2 of fantasy football. And don't forget, as the week goes on, we will have everything that you guys need to take home a victory in week 2. Start sits at running backs, wide receivers, running backs and wide receivers that will dominate in week 2. Trade videos, last minute waiver wire videos, start sit streams for you guys. So make sure you guys are checking out all the videos throughout the week. I will link everything I can as the week goes on down below. And by the time you're watching this, the playlist thing should be popping up. Most of the videos will be on those playlists as well for you guys. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.